All right, let's dive into what has to be one of the most improbable stories in all of history. We're talking about how a tiny, obscure Jewish sect, a movement built around an executed preacher, somehow grew to become the official faith of the very empire that killed him. How does that even happen?
So the question that historians, scholars, have been wrestling with for centuries is really this. How does a preacher, an obscure guy from a remote, kind of rebellious corner of the massive Roman Empire,
end up inspiring a faith that doesn't just survive, but eventually overcomes that same empire? I mean, the odds are just unbelievable. And the story really kicks off with this wild contrast.
Okay, so to really get this journey, we've got to set the scene. Picture the 1st century. Rome is the absolute power in the world. And you've got these two figures who are, well, they're polar opposites.
So on one hand, you've got Caesar Augustus, right? His face is literally on every coin, often stamped with the words Divi Filius, which means Son of God. He's the ruler, the savior of the world, the big guy. And on the other hand, you have Jesus of Nazareth, a poor artisan, a subject living under that empire, preaching to peasants. Think about it. Augustus dies and is officially made a god by the state. Jesus, he's executed by that same state as a common criminal. Honestly, from a purely historical viewpoint, there's nothing that special about Jesus at the time. Billions of people lived and died just like him, completely unknown. So what on earth made his story survive?
Well, the key, the really crucial part, is what happened after he died. Because for decades, the story of Jesus wasn't written down at all. It was just an oral tradition. People telling stories, passing them from one person to the next.
So Jesus dies around 30 CE. And for the next 40 years, think about that, 4 decades, there are no written Gospels. 0. His followers are just talking, telling and retelling stories about him. So what changes? What's the trigger? It's a massive, devastating historical event. In 70 CE, the Roman army marches into Jerusalem and completely destroys the Second Temple, the absolute heart of Jewish life and religion. It's a catastrophe. And in that moment of crisis, suddenly there's this urgent need to write everything down, to try and make sense of it all. And that's when we get the very first gospel, the Gospel of Mark.
And this is a really good time to ask, what even is a gospel? Well, the word itself comes from the Greek for good news. But it's super important to understand, this isn't a biography in the way we think of one today. It's not journalism. Most scholars see these texts as a community's way of interpreting the life and death of Jesus. And they're shaped profoundly by the trauma of that war with Rome.
Now this leads to another really critical point. The Jesus movement, it didn't just pop up as a new religion. No way. It actually started as a sect within Judaism. And 1st century Judaism was this incredibly diverse, complex world.
So you can think of it at first as a kind of family quarrel. The Gospels, especially one like Matthew, are basically reflecting this really intense debate happening between different Jewish groups about, okay, the temple is gone, so what's the future of our faith? But the final, really painful split, that comes a bit later, after a second Jewish revolt against Rome fails, the Bar Kokhba revolt. See, the rebels in that war called their leader the Messiah, but the Christians were like, wait, we already have our Messiah, Jesus. So they refused to join the fight, and that was the moment the divide became permanent.
There's a scholar who puts it perfectly, I think. He says the New Testament really tells a story of a broken relationship. And it was a split that would have these just unimaginably tragic consequences for centuries to come. Okay, so now they're a separate group, and these early Christians are facing threats from two sides. They've got this existential battle going on. On the outside, you've got persecution from the mighty Roman Empire, and on the inside, deep, profound divisions. When we think of persecution, we might imagine this huge empire-wide manhunt. But a lot of the time, it was more bureaucratic and local. This right here, this is the actual procedure a Roman governor named Pliny the Younger used around 112 CE. And it's just chillingly simple. You get brought in. They ask you 3 times, are you a Christian? If you keep saying yes, you're executed. That's it. The only way out is to curse Christ and make a sacrifice to the Roman gods. See, for the Romans, religion was a public, civic duty. But for Christians, it was this exclusive thing, and that made them look suspicious, dangerously antisocial. But, and this is so important, the threat wasn't just coming from the outside. The early church, well, it wasn't one unified thing at all. It was more like a collection of competing Christianities, all vying for dominance. You had the Pauline Christians, really focused on Jesus' death and resurrection. Then you had groups like the Gnostics, who believed Jesus was this pure spirit who only seemed human and came to reveal secret knowledge. Then there were the Marcionites, who wanted to just cut all ties with Judaism completely, even rejecting the God of the Old Testament. I mean, these groups were in a battle for the very soul of the movement.
So you've got to wonder, with all this pressure from the outside and the inside, how on earth did this thing grow? Well, despite all that, the core message had this incredibly powerful appeal. Think about it. You're in a society where maybe 3/4 of the population is either enslaved or just dirt poor. And then this message comes along that says that every single person, man, woman, child, slave, you name it, is made in the image of God. And because of that, they have enormous value. In a world that was so brutal and hierarchical, that was a revolutionary idea. Just an absolutely extraordinary and powerful concept.
And all of this brings us to the story's dramatic climax. This is the moment, the turning point where everything changes, when the faith of the powerless suddenly becomes the faith of the powerful.
Okay, so before the year 312, I want you to just stop and think about what the cross meant to people. It wasn't a piece of jewelry. It was the ultimate symbol of Roman state terror, a gruesome, horrific way to execute criminals and rebels. It was a symbol of nothing but shame, defeat, and absolute agony.
And then, just like that, everything flips on its head. The Roman emperor himself, Constantine, supposedly has a vision of a cross in the sky right before a massive battle. He wins the battle, and he gives the credit to the Christian God. All of a sudden, the symbol of state terror becomes the triumphant, official emblem of the Roman Empire. It's got to be one of the most stunning, complete reversals of symbolism in the history of the world. So this created a totally new reality. Constantine was a master politician, right? And he saw Christianity as a kind of social glue, something that could unite his fracturing empire. So his patronage starts flowing in. We're talking state money to build churches and copy Bibles. The faith and imperial power became completely intertwined. But here's the thing. With that power came a demand for unity. So Constantine starts using the power of the state to go after other Christian groups, the ones they now called heretics, like the Gnostics, to enforce one single correct version of the faith.
And so we kind of end up right back where we started, with a big question. This whole movement began with a man who was executed by the empire. It was a faith for the poor, for the people on the margins. And somehow, it ended up as the official religion of that same empire. Which leaves us with this one last thing to really think about. What happens when a faith of the powerless becomes the power?